Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez, educated in this country at Brown and Cornell and Columbia, has been working on advanced techniques, nutritional approaches to degenerative diseases such as cancer, multiple sclerosis, and other diseases of the degenerative type. So I believe he's getting his microphone on right now. In fact, Dr. Marichal is renting his to him, I believe. Let's give a nice warm welcome to Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez. Thanks.
Okay, I've been asked to talk slowly. It's genetically, physiologically, and morally impossible for me to do that. I'll try, but probably fail. I'm going to talk about cancer today, particularly William Donald Kelly. Now, for Dr. Kelly, cancer began with eye problems. He was riding down the road in his antique Cadillac, which he called Twinkles, and he noticed he had trouble seeing the street signs. He was 35 years old, and he had perfect vision up to that point. He didn't pay much attention to it, but over the ensuing months, his vision got progressively worse. And he went to his ophthalmologist and said, look, you're 35 years old, you're nearsighted, you need glasses. Well, it wasn't too big a deal, but about 3 months later, he noticed that as he was working on his patients, now he was an orthodontist and did a lot of close work in patients' mouths, he noticed he had trouble seeing the teeth clearly of his patients and doing the intricate work required. He went back to his ophthalmologist and said, this is kind of interesting, you need bifocals. Well, that didn't sit too kindly on Kelly's soul, because he figured 35 years old was too young for bifocals, but he wore them. And they seemed to work well for about 3 months. And then he noticed, well, with his bifocals, he could see the distance, far distance pretty well, and he could read and he could do his intricate work in his patient's mouths okay, but the intermediate distances were getting kind of fuzzy. This was unusual, so he went back to his ophthalmologist. He says, by God, you need trifocals. This is about the first time I've ever had a patient need a trifocal. So this was kind of a blow to Dr. Kelly. Just about the time he needed bifocals, he started developing muscle cramps. Initially, they weren't too serious. They were in his arms, and he figured this was because he was spending 12 hours a day working over his patients. But the pains got progressively worse. They were like severe Charlie horses in his arms. Then they evolved to involve his legs, and pretty soon he was getting terrible chest pain. In fact, he ended up in the local emergency room 3 times with terrible chest pain, thinking it was a heart attack. The EKGs were normal. He went to his local doctor, who just suggested that he was working too hard and needed to take more time off. Kelly did that, but the pains didn't get any better. And just about the time he was having problems with these muscle pains, he noticed his hair started to fall out. Now, he had a thick head of hair, and baldness did not run in his family. So at age 35, when his hair started to fall out, this was pretty serious. He went to his doctor, and his doctor said, well, it's just stress and aging. There's nothing you can do about it. About the time his hair started to fall out, he developed a severe cataclysmic depression. Now, Dr. Kelly had never been depressed a day in his life. This is a man who worked 14 hours a day as an orthodontist, loved his work, had a wonderful family, 4 kids, all adopted that he loved dearly, a good wife. He was very active in community affairs. He just wasn't a depressed type, had never been depressed, but suddenly he'd wake up in the morning with crying spells. He was losing interest in his work, losing interest in his family, thought about chucking orthodonture to go live in the mountains of Colorado, which was very unusual for him. He went to his doctor and begged for antidepressants. The doctor said, no, you're just working too hard, you've got to take some more time off. Well, Kelly took more time off, and the depression got worse, and just about the time when he was starting to get suicidal, his belly expanded suddenly overnight, and he went to his doctor and said, you've got to go into the hospital. Well, Dr. Kelly was very well known in the Texas community where he lived, and they called in all the local surgeons and gastroenterologists, and the surgeon took one look at this man and said, this guy's got terminal cancer. Now, in those days, this is about 1964, they didn't have sophisticated CAT scans or ultrasounds. They basically just had simple ultrasound equipment and x-rays. They did a whole series of x-rays and found that he had lesions in his lungs that looked like metastatic disease, a huge tumor in his right hip. His liver was 3 times its normal size. It appeared they had a pancreatic tumor that had metastasized very quickly. The surgeon said he was too sick for surgery. The doctors told his wife he had 4 to 6 to 8 weeks to live. Well, that was some bad news. The news got even worse. His wife handled this sudden occurrence by packing up and leaving Dr. Kelly with 4 young kids and dying of cancer. Well, Kelly did what any sane man would do in a circumstance like that. He called his mother. Now Kelly's mother is kind of an unusual character, and I've talked about her before in my other lectures, and you have to meet Mama Kelly to really appreciate her. She raised 3 sons on a dirt-poor Kansas farm, 80 acres, during the Depression. Her husband had died of a heart attack, leaving her with 3 kids, and she got him through college and graduate school. Now, Kelly's older brother is a world-famous dental surgeon, and his younger brother is an expert on Robert Browning the poet. In fact, Professor Kelly runs the Browning Foundation, is world-renowned for his work. And, of course, then there's crazy Dr. Kelly, the cancer doctor. Now, Kelly called his mother and said, look, I have a problem. She said, what's the problem? She says, well, I've just been told I have 6 weeks to live. I've got 4 young kids, and my wife left me. What am I going to do? Well, his mother got very angry with him. He says, what you're going to do is you're going to get over your cancer. He said, those kids are adopted. If you die, those kids are going back to the orphanage, and I'm not going to take them because I already raised 3 kids. So you're going to get well. He said to his mother, well, that's absolutely, totally impossible. I have the best doctors in Texas telling me I got 6 to 8 weeks to live with terminal pancreatic cancer. And she said, nonsense. That day, she got on a plane, flew down to Texas, and walked into Kelly's house to get him well. Now, how did Mama Kelly approach Dr. Kelly's terminal prognosis? Well, the first thing she did is she took all the food in his cupboards and threw it away. Now, Kelly was probably the preeminent connoisseur of junk food that I have ever known. He knew the ingredients of every brand of chocolate bar available in the U.S., and he basically lived on chocolate bars and Fritos for years, so it wasn't too surprising that at age 36 he would develop terminal cancer. His mother took that junk and threw it away. Now, she was a very wise woman. She'd grown up on the land, she'd grown up on a farm, had raised farm animals and raised her kids according to very natural principles with good, healthy food. The first thing she did is she went to the local health food store and loaded up on fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, nuts, seeds, whole grains, no animal protein. And from that day, she put her son on a very rigorous diet, a complete vegetarian diet, a completely raw foods diet consisting of nothing but fresh fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, beans, sprouted beans, that sort of thing. Absolutely no animal protein, no fish, no poultry, no red meat, no dairy products, nothing. This was a very difficult diet for Kelly to follow because he loved Big Macs, he loved Hershey bars, he loved Fritos. But his mother wouldn't allow those things in the house, and he had no choice but to do it. To his absolute total astonishment, 2 weeks passed, 4 weeks passed, he felt a little stronger. 6 weeks passed, he felt better. 8 weeks passed, he didn't die. 3 months passed, his mother walked into his bedroom one morning and said, okay, 3 months have passed, you're getting better, you're going back to work. And he said, now wait a minute, I got terminal pancreatic cancer. She says, you got 4 kids that got to eat, and your wife emptied out the bank account, so you're going to work whether you want to or not. And from that day, he started seeing his patients again. He would see a patient and sleep for about 15 minutes and see a patient and sleep for about 15 minutes. The miracle was, first, that he wasn't dead. Secondly, that he really was getting better. Now, Dr. Kelly is a true scientist in the traditions of true scientists. Now, scientists are different from the rest of us because they ask questions that the rest of us, like myself, would be too lazy or too afraid to ask. And he said, I cannot believe that my mother is the first person in the history of the world that figured out a diet of raw fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and grains, as horrible as it is, can stabilize cancer. He said, I can't believe she's that smart. So he went to his local library. He's kind of feeling feisty. He went to the library and see what he could find. His local library, fortunately, had a copy of Max Gerson's 1959 book called 50 Cases. Now, Gerson is an interesting character in medical history. He was a very prominent German physician who, during the 20s and 30s, developed his own nutritional approach to degenerative diseases, involving primarily a diet of raw fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, and lots of fresh vegetable juices, 8-10 glasses a day. Now, with this diet, Gerson had great success with a whole range of degenerative diseases, from arthritis to and including cancer. Now, during the 30s, with the advent of Nazism, Gerson, being Jewish, left Germany and came to New York, where he set up his own clinic, and over about a 20-year period, continued to have a fair amount of success with this particular diet. Now, Gerson hypothesized that meat was somehow toxic to the human body and toxic to the liver, and raw fruits and raw vegetables helped the body clean out, stimulated the liver, enabled the immune system to work better. And he wasn't too sure of the science, but he did know his results were fairly good. And he published this in 1959. Kelly was a little ecstatic about this because it gave confirmation that the diet he was on really did have the possibility to work. Now, he got progressively stronger over a 3 to 6 month period, but he kind of stabilized. He was lucky. As I always say, Kelly was lucky in a very unlucky way. He was unlucky, of course, because he had pancreatic cancer, but he was lucky that he had such bad cancer that the tumors protruded from his liver and he could feel them. So he could really monitor his own progress. He knew that when he got lazy on the diet, which did occasionally occur, those tumors would grow within days, and he knew when he stuck to the diet religiously, those tumors would regress. So he had his own tumor marker sitting right there in his belly. He could feel these tumors. And that was fairly fortunate. But about the 6th, 7th month, those tumors didn't shrink anymore. And just about the time the tumors stopped shrinking, he developed severe digestive problems. Well, of course, one of the obvious problems with pancreatic cancer is it destroys your pancreas. Well, we know what the pancreas does. It produces insulin, it produces digestive enzymes. Without those digestive enzymes, you can't digest food. And one of the common serious problems with patients with any kind of pancreatic disease, be it cancer or pancreatitis, is severe digestive problems. Bloating, gas, nausea, vomiting, the dumping syndrome. They get diarrhea alternating with constipation. They just can't digest their food or utilize the nutrients properly. Well, Kelly figured there had to be some simple solution to this, so he went to his local pharmacy and talked to the druggist, who was a good friend of his. He said, oh, that's no big deal. We'll give you some pancreatic enzymes. And he pulled out a bottle of Viabin pancreatic enzymes. We're talking 1964. He said, you take these, they'll provide the enzymes that your own pancreas isn't producing. It's very simple. They'll take care of your gas and your bloating. Well, Kelly, if nothing else, was a man of excess, and if he was going to buy 1 bottle of pancreatic enzymes, he was going to buy 100. So he bought about 10 cases of these enzymes, and that day started taking them. First he'd take 3 with meals and 4 with meals and 5 with meals. After about 3 days, he was taking about 50 capsules of pancreatic enzymes with each meal. And he noticed something began to happen in his gut. Every time he took a dose of enzymes, he'd feel kind of a twinge of pain in those areas of the tumor in his liver. After a couple of weeks on these enzymes, he noticed that these tumors seemed actually to be softening. In fact, he began to believe that they were, after this period of stabilization on the diet, were actually shrinking and resolving. He said, this doesn't make any sense. I take these enzymes, and within half an hour of taking them, I feel some pain, gnawing, something going on in these areas of tumor. Those enzymes are destroyed in the gut. I can't conceive how this is possible. I don't see what pancreatic enzymes would have to do with these tumors in my liver. Well, Kelly went to his library. Again, Kelly, being a scientist, was never satisfied without finding an answer. And he looked up pancreatic enzymes and did a literature search. And he was fortunate to find a name in the literature, John Beard, probably one of the most brilliant men of the 20th century and the least known men of the 20th century. John Beard was an eminent embryologist working out of the University of Edinburgh in Scotland during the 1880s, 1890s, and the turn of the century. Now, Beard, like Kelly, started out with no interest in cancer whatsoever. He was an embryologist. He was interested in comparative embryology, particularly in the placenta. His area of expertise was the placenta. Now, we know what the placenta is. After fertilization in a mammal, the embryo produces an organ called the placenta, which literally eats into the mother's uterus. Now, it serves as an anchor for the growing fetus. It also serves as the connection between the blood supply of the mother, which brings nutrients to the baby, and the waste products of the baby. There's a kind of a point of connection between the blood supplies of the baby and the mother, and that's how the baby is fed, and that's how the baby gets rid of its waste materials. Now, Beard was a smart man, and he noticed that in every mammalian species that he studied, and he studied dozens, that the placenta would grow into the uterus and grow and grow and grow, and that at a particular time in every species would suddenly stop growing. In mice, it was 10 days. In humans, 56 days. In every human embryo, virtually to the day, 56 days, that placenta would stop growing. In elephants, it was something like 300 days. Beard was particularly interested in this because he realized something unusual about the placenta, and he was the first person to make this observation, though not the last. He thought of the placenta as kind of a tumor, because indeed it does behave like a tumor. The placenta is a piece of tissue that invades the mother's uterus, much as a tumor would invade the mother's uterus. Now, usually, the placenta reaches a certain point of growth and stops. Sometimes it doesn't. And in women where the placenta doesn't stop growing, they develop a very serious cancer called choriocarcinoma that used to be one of the most aggressive cancers around. Fortunately, there is a chemotherapeutic agent, methotrexate, that really does knock it out, and today 80 to 90% of these women can be cured. Prior to the advent of methotrexate, it was a very deadly disease. So there is a tradition of the placenta behaving like a tumor, and Beard was aware of this. And he made the connection in his own mind. He said, if I could figure out why the placenta stops growing at a certain point, 56 days in the mother, maybe I could figure out a way to stop tumors from growing. It was a great leap of faith, and it led to 10 years of research. What Beard did is, in a variety of animal studies, he would investigate the growth and development of every organ system there was, every tissue, every organ, trying to find some connection between the development of the embryo and the cessation of growth of the placenta. And it took him 10 years before he hit upon the fact that the only connection that existed, the only thing that changed, for example, day 56 in the humans, day 10 in the mice, day 300 in the elephants, was the day the placenta stopped growing, the embryonic pancreas started to work. There was no other connection. That's kind of an interesting concept, because embryos really don't need a pancreas. They get all the nutrition they need from the mother's blood supply. They don't need digestive enzymes. They're given food for free right from the mother's blood supply. They don't have to chew it or digest it. In fact, their digestive system really is non-functional. It's not needed until the day they're born and they start eating through their mouths. But yet on day 56, which is pretty early in embryonic development, the placenta started working in humans. It started producing pancreatic enzymes. And Beard said, what possible function could these enzymes have other than to stop the placenta from growing? And if indeed they do stop the placenta from growing, perhaps they could stop tumors from growing. In November 1904, Beard presented his hypothesis that the pancreatic enzymes represent the main defense against cancer, and not the immune system or any other system. Presented it before the Edinburgh Scientific Society, and he was nearly universally laughed at. I say universally laughed at because there was one very bright Army surgeon in the audience who was a cancer specialist, and of course in 1904 there was no cancer therapy other than surgery, and this guy had seen a lot of his patients die, and he was willing to listen to anybody, even this crazy embryologist out of Edinburgh who proposed that the pancreatic enzymes could cure cancer. After the lecture and all the booing and the throwing of tomatoes, this Army captain went up to see Beard and said, I'd like to try your therapy. Well, over the next few months, Beard and the surgeon developed some injectable pancreatic enzymes. The first case documented in the medical literature was a man with metastatic laryngeal cancer. Now, even today, laryngeal cancer is a really nasty disease. It doesn't have a very good prognosis. This man had metastatic disease with a huge tumor sitting in his throat. This Army captain injected the enzymes with Beard's assistance over a period of 2 weeks, and within 2 weeks, that tumor was one day just thrown up by this patient. There it was lying in front of him. And he had it evaluated, and it was completely dead. And this is the first documented case of a patient apparently cured by the use of injectable pancreatic enzymes. It was published in the British Medical Journal and caused an enormous controversy. The usual controversy. The patient didn't have cancer, the results were fake, that wasn't really a tumor, the same things that we hear today. A number of doctors, however, did get interested in Beard's work, and over the following years there were about 40 or 50 papers published in eminent journals both in the U.S. and in Europe documenting the regression of tumors, in fact some cures, with the use of injectable pancreatic enzymes. Now you say, well, that's wonderful, but why didn't Beard's work take hold if it was so good? Well, in fact, in 1911, Beard published a brilliant book called The Enzyme Therapy of Cancer, and I think about 15 people ever bothered to read it. And the reason is, it's just about the time he published his book, Madame Curie announced that radiation was a safe, non-toxic cure for virtually all cancers. Madame Curie had a fabulous reputation. She was that brilliant Polish immigrant to Paris who had done wonderful work with radiation. And she proposed that at that time was believed that radiation was perfectly safe. It would take a generation of radiation oncologists to die of leukemia before we realized that it wasn't as safe as we thought it was. She also was mistaken in believing that it would be useful against virtually every cancer. There are very few cancers that are radiation sensitive for any prolonged period of time. However, Madame Curie was so well loved by the world's press that this was presented as the answer to cancer. And when he died about 1920, he died in obscurity, and the enzyme therapy was forgotten until Dr. Kelly, 1964, because of the use of the pancreatic enzymes given to him by his local pharmacist, began to suspect that these enzymes were getting rid of that tumor in his gut. There was one problem. Beard said the enzymes had to be injected, that they would be destroyed in the gut. In fact, every medical student, every dental student who's ever gone through dental or medical school in the U.S. or any other country is taught that orally ingested pancreatic enzymes are wonderful digestive aids, but they're destroyed in the gut and they are not absorbed active and intact in the gut. That doesn't happen. Kelly was taking the enzymes orally, and he said, wait a minute, Beard said they have to be injected. I'm taking them orally, and I know something's going on here. He went back to the medical literature. Lo and behold, during the 1930s and 1940s, there were a whole series of wonderful experiments documenting that orally ingested pancreatic enzymes in both human and animal studies are absorbed active and intact in the gut and do serve a variety of physiological functions. The easiest way to document that is a 24-hour urine collection. You feed a patient a huge amount of pancreatic enzymes, measure the urine, collect urine for 24 hours, and you can see how much of those enzymes are going to be excreted in the urine. It turns out that virtually 100% of what you take orally comes out in the urine, not in the intestinal tract, which means they have to be absorbed. Well, that problem resolved, Kelly began to think about the raw diet he'd been on. Now remember, Kelly's therapy began with his mother's raw vegetarian diet. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, all raw, lots of juices. He said, I wonder why that diet stabilized me initially. And he was kind of taken by this idea of Beard's enzyme theory. And he says, you know, raw food is a wonderful thing. It's got lots of vitamins and minerals and trace elements. And it's got loaded with nutrients. And this is, of course, widely recognized. But he said, when you cook food, and his mother insisted the food had to be raw. When you cook food, you don't really destroy too many of the vitamins and the minerals and trace elements. You might destroy some of them, like a little bit of the pyridoxine, but most vitamins, minerals, and trace elements are not sensitive to heat. So Kelly said, why does this diet have to be a raw diet? Why did Max Gerson use a raw diet? What is it about raw food that helps cancer patients? And he kept thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking. He said, well, the vitamins and the minerals and the trace, they're not destroyed by heat. What is destroyed by heat? And he said, the only thing that's destroyed by heat are enzymes. Well, raw food is loaded with enzymes. It's just packed with enzymes. Every cell in every body has at least 50,000 enzyme systems. So when you eat raw food, you're getting a load of enzymes. When you eat cooked food, you get nothing. Enzymes are heat sensitive. They're destroyed and inactivated above 118 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you cook food, you don't destroy the vitamins and the minerals and trace elements, but you destroy every enzyme in every cell in that food. That's a pretty important concept when you think about it. When you think about it, we are the only species of animal in the history of the world, 1 billion years of life evolution, that cooks its food. Every other species of animal eats raw food except for us. We're so bright, we decided cooking food's better. We decided that. Some anthropologists will tell you 50,000 years ago. Some say, oh, there's evidence a couple 100,000 years ago we start to cook food. It tastes better when you cook it. You give a dog raw food or cooked food, it's going to eat the cooked food. Likes the taste of it. But when you eat cooked food, you don't eat any enzymes. Now, Kelly was thinking about this, and he says, I'm just a dentist. I can't believe that I'm the only person in the history of the world that ever thought about the fact that when you cook food, you do something terribly profound, like destroy all the enzymes in it, and that might have an effect on health. He went back to the library, Lo and behold, he learned about the work of Edward Howell. Who's Edward Howell? Howell was a doctor, graduated from the University of Illinois Medical School about 1920. Brilliant doctor, great career, except for one thing, he was sick as a dog. I guess today, if he were alive, he'd be diagnosed as chronic fatigue. He had the weak and dizzy. He was 24 years old. He couldn't get out of bed. No interest in his work. He was depressed. He was fatigued. He had fevers, chills, and sweats. Now, when a doctor's sick, it's pretty scary, and you always go to the best doctor and try and find out the best answer for what you've got. So he went everywhere, from Columbia Presbyterian to the Mayo Clinic. And they told him, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just too stressed. You don't really want to be a doctor. You need a psychiatrist. Well, Beard spent his life, even 1920 they were telling patients that. Beard didn't like that answer. He'd spent his whole life wanting to be a doctor. Here he was, 24 years old with a medical degree, unable to function. Out of desperation, believe me, no one ever goes to a natural therapy generally as a first choice. They go out of desperation. Out of desperation, Beard ended up in a spa run by a local naturopath in Illinois. And the naturopath took one look at Howell and said, he's saying Beard, I mean Howell, took one look at Howell and says, you're going on raw foods, raw fruits, raw vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains. The Mama Kelly diet, the Gerson diet, 3 different people coming up with the same diet. Howell was too sick to ask questions. He wasn't thinking very clearly. He went on the diet because he was desperate. In 3 months, he was a new man. He was virtually completely well. As he got better, he felt strong enough to ask questions. And he asked this wonderful old naturopath, what is it about raw food that got me well? And the guy gave him one answer, enzymes. Well, in 1920, we didn't know too much about enzymes, but we knew some. Enzymes are catalysts. They enable reactions to occur both in biological and non-biological systems with a minimum input of energy. You know, there are reactions that occur in the human cell that, if it weren't for enzymes, would require 1,000 to 2,000 degrees centigrade. We would disappear in a puff of smoke. Enzymes allow reactions to occur with a minimum amount of heat and energy input. They increase the efficiency of metabolic and both biologic and non-biological chemical reactions. When you cook food, this naturopath said, you don't destroy the vitamins, the minerals, the trace elements. You don't destroy the fat and the protein. There's as much fat in a cooked McDonald's as there is in raw beef. What you destroy are the enzymes. And he told Howell, even then it was known, that all biological enzymes are inactivated above 118 degrees. Well, that struck Howell as a pretty profound concept because he made the same connection Kelly made 30 years later, 40 years later. That we are the only species of animal in the history of the world that cooked its food, and we're the only species of animals that is eating enzyme-dead food. And that might have a profound effect on our health. We all know about the vitamins, the minerals, the trace elements, protein, fats, and carbohydrates. We never think about the enzymes in food. Howell perceived, and so did this naturopath, and so did Kelly 40 years later, that the enzymes in food may be the single most important nutrient in food, the nutrients required for repair and rebuilding of damaged tissue, for preventing disease. After all, it is enzymes that are the metabolic machinery. And those enzymes from food may be used in the body for repair and rebuilding. Certainly Gerson's work and Kelly's own diet that he was following, courtesy of his mother, proved that there was something in raw food that could lead to health. And it had to be the enzymes. Howell spent 50 years of his life documenting the effect of raw foods on human health. His studies are absolutely profound. He's probably, like Beard, one of the most brilliant men of the 20th century, and like Beard, probably one of the least read because he was outside the orthodoxy and no one paid any attention to him. Just remember, the next time you sit down to cook food, that there are billions of other animal species that are laughing at you. And if you're, I always say, if you're a gambler, the odds aren't very good. If you believe in evolution, the idea that you're the only species of animals that think cooking food is a good idea, I'd think twice about it. So when you eat lunch today, think about that. Kelly was doing pretty well. He had his diet down, he had his enzymes down, he understood raw foods, he understood pancreatic enzymes, and he was getting well. He was 9 months into his therapy, the tumors were regressing, he was working 8 hours a day seeing patients, everything was going well, and then he started to get sick. He woke up one day feeling too tired, he canceled his patient, stayed in bed. The next day he felt worse. Tired, fatigued, he thought he was getting the flu. He asked his mother said, just stay on the diet, stay on the enzymes. His mother was a pretty tough captain. She said, you just keep doing the program. Third day he was sicker. He developed nausea. Fourth day he started vomiting. This was a bit scary because he'd take the doses, the 50 capsules of enzymes, and throw them up immediately. Kelly was a tough character. He'd take the 50 pills again, he'd throw up again, and he had this battle with his stomach. By the end of the day, he gave up. He said, I just have intestinal flu, I'll stay off the pills. Stayed off the pills 2 or 3 days and started to feel better. He said, okay, good, I can go back on my pills. Now, he was scared because he knew if he stayed off those enzymes, those tumors were going to grow. So after about 3 or 4 days off them, he felt strong enough, went back on the pills. For 2 or 3 days, he did fine. Suddenly, he started getting sick again. First day, he felt tired, then fatigued, then lethargic, then fevers, chills, sweats. By the 4th day on these enzymes, he started throwing up his guts. This was kind of scary because he looked at those pancreatic enzymes as his lifeline. If he couldn't get them down, he was going to die. And he had 4 young kids, and if he died, they were going back to the orphanage. He had no choice. Stayed off the pills a couple of days, felt better. But as he stayed off the pills, he noticed, because remember, Kelly was lucky in a very unlucky way and had his own tumor markers sticking out of his belly. He noticed that off the enzymes, those tumors started to grow. He didn't like that too much. On the enzymes, they'd start to shrink, but he'd get sick. Off the enzymes, the tumors would grow, he'd feel better. On the enzymes, the tumors would shrink, he'd feel worse. It doesn't make sense, he said. On the enzymes, the tumors are going away, I should feel better. Off the enzymes, the tumors are growing, I should feel worse, and the opposite's happening. On the enzymes, when the tumors break down, I feel sicker. He kept thinking about this. Kelly being a scientist, I'd have probably gone to bed and forgotten, probably cried, gone to bed, forgotten about the whole thing. Kelly stayed up day after day after day. Kelly was a wonderful man. Whenever he had a problem, he wouldn't sleep. Now, I lived in his house for a year and a half, and there were a lot of unsolved problems. And I can remember days when he wouldn't let me sleep because something had to be thought of. I need about 6 or 7 hours a night. He needs about 30 minutes. So it's kind of a difficult thing to be around him physiologically. Also psychologically and spiritually, but mainly physiologically. So Kelly was trying to figure out this problem of why he felt worse when the tumors broke down. And one night, in the middle of the night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, he suddenly figured it out. He said, I know what's happening. I'm breaking down cancer, and that's wonderful. And these tumor wastes are making me sick. Tumor wastes are poisonous. He said, that's what it is. And a light went off. And he said, a lot of the symptoms that people are getting on chemo, now back in 1964, we didn't have elaborate chemotherapy regimens, but we certainly had chemo, and patients got sick on them, on these regimens. Kelly said, it's the darn tumor breaking down. I bet that's why people get sick when they're treated for cancer. The tumor breaks down, you get poisoned with tumor waste. Kelly said nothing on earth is more toxic to the cancer patient than dead tumor waste. That was his statement. And it seemed to be true. Off the pills, when the tumor stopped growing, he would feel better. On the pills, the tumors would break down, he would feel sick. And he got a lot of symptoms. Fevers to 103, chills, sweats, almost like a very severe allergic anaphylactic serum sickness-like response. Muscle aches and pains. And he said it was the tumor waste. Well, that led to another investigation. Kelly was looking for some way to help the body get rid of tumor waste. And he went to the medical literature, and he figured he had to find some way, because he had to increase the efficiency of the program. He had to enable the patient, or in this case himself, to stay on those pills, because those pills were the lifeline. Well, he went through a number of medical journals, he went through a number of medical textbooks, and the thing that kept coming back to him is the thing that raises the eyebrows of my orthodox colleagues more than anything, and people will probably laugh when I mention it, and of course that's the coffee enemas. Nothing in the history of the world has generated more derision and more controversy than coffee enemas. Now, Kelly learned about coffee enemas, ironically, not from some strange esoteric alternative health publication, but from the Merck Manual. The Merck Manual included coffee enemas as a therapeutic tool from 1899 to 1977. And Kelly learned about it right in the Merck Manual. Now, it was documented during the 1920s and 30s that when you take coffee rectally, the caffeine stimulates the liver to release its toxins. It dumps its toxins more or less like a dump truck. It's not surprising when you think about it. Very often when a patient comes in advanced asthma, really wheezing, you don't try and get pills down orally. You use a rectal suppository of theophylline. Well, theophylline is a methylxanthine. It causes smooth muscle relaxation in the lung and the bronchi. Well, caffeine is a methylxanthine. It causes smooth muscle relaxation in the gut. You take theophylline rectally, you can block an asthmatic attack. You take caffeine rectally, you can stimulate the gallbladder and the liver ducts to dump their waste. This has been documented by very sophisticated radiographic studies, which about 30 people have read. So the coffee enemas seemed like the logical thing to do, and Kelly wasn't too happy about that, being a very neat gentleman. But he figured he didn't have any choice, because he wasn't just dealing with some esoteric research project or some student or some study. He was dealing with himself, and his life depended on him. So very reluctantly, he went to the store, and he says he got his local chock full of nuts coffee. I mean, he didn't use organic coffee the first time. He bought an enema bag from his local pharmacy, and very, very reluctantly and very gingerly, he brewed up his coffee and gave himself his first coffee enema. Now, Kelly was a smart man, so he stayed on before he took his first enema, he went on his enzymes for about 4 or 5 days until he was really feeling sick. He had a fever of 103, nausea, he was vomiting, he had muscle aches and pains. He really was sick. He wanted to see whether these enemas could work. And he did an enema, and with half an hour, his fever went from 104 to 99, his muscle aches and pains resolved, and he felt almost normal. It was almost a miraculous occurrence in Kelly's own mind, and from that day on, he did coffee enemas, and he's still doing them today, and he's been doing them since that first day, and he hasn't missed a single day. So that was the third part of the Kelly program. First part diet, second part the pancreatic enzymes, the third part the coffee enemas. Crazy Dr. Kelly. Well, he got better. After about 1.5 years, 2 years, his tumors were gone. He was back at work as an orthodontist. When he hung up his shingle again, people didn't come to him for straightening their teeth, though. Kelly developed quite a reputation as the crazy dentist who cured himself with his mother's nutritional program. And the first day he would open up his office, he got calls from people with cancer and has asthma and multiple sclerosis from the local outlying towns where he lived in West Texas, wanted to come by and go on that diet too. Well, within a couple of years, Kelly was no longer treating people with crooked teeth. He was basically treating primarily advanced cancer patients with this nutritional program. And he developed very quickly an international reputation as the dentist who cured cancer patients with a nutritional program. He developed such an international reputation that the local medical society had him thrown in jail in 1969 and had copies of his book, which he was then publishing, absconded and burned. Pat McGrady, who was in the audience, was talking about how his father's book was burned. Well, Kelly's book was burned too. You don't want to offend the AMA, and there's nothing offends the AMA more than a dentist who cures cancer. It's not supposed to happen. Well, I understand the AMA. Look, I'm an MD. I'm a little offended by the idea too. I mean, it kind of bothers me that Dr. Kelly did it. Okay, so Kelly had this wonderful reputation. He had this wonderful program, a diet of raw fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains. He had the wonderful pancreatic enzymes. He added other vitamins and minerals to help the enzymes work better, and the coffee enemas. And he was doing pretty well. But he wasn't doing well enough. And Kelly always said, and I always say it, you don't learn from your successes. Successes make you feel arrogant and wonderful, and they please your mother. You learn from your failures. You learn from your failures. Now, by about 1970, 69, 70, Kelly was probably getting about 50% of his patients well. The bad news is he was losing 50%. And he quite couldn't figure out why. I mean, he was pretty pleased because most of these patients were pretty sick, but he couldn't figure out why he was losing them. And he would try everything on a patient who was failing. He would increase the amount of fruit, decrease the amount of fruit, increase the amount of grains, decrease the amount of grains, give more juices, give less juices, change the relationship of beans to rice. But there were patients that no matter what manipulation he did, they would do badly. And one of them was the woman who was going to become his second wife, Susie. Now, Susie's a remarkable woman. She didn't have cancer. She had allergies. When I say allergies, I mean the worst case of allergies in the history of medicine. She was so sensitive to iodine that she could not walk within 10 miles of the ocean or she would suffer an anaphylactic reaction. She had to carry adrenaline around with her all the time, repeatedly, at least twice a week. She would have anaphylactic reactions. Some bright allergist had treated her with desensitization shots and had used dirty needles, and she developed hepatitis. So not only did she have terrible allergies, but she had chronic active hepatitis, which in and of itself is a fatal disease in many cases. She was 24 years old and she was dying. There were about 4 foods that she could eat. She was getting worse. She figured by the time she was down to distilled water, it was over. She knew Kelly was primarily a cancer doctor, but she figured if he was smart enough to cure cancer, he could cure her allergies. She arrived in his office very sick. Kelly put her on his wonderful diet, the raw fruits, the raw vegetables, the juices, the enemas, the enzymes, the vitamins and minerals. And within 3 or 4 months, she was doing really well. And by 6 months, she was doing well enough that she could eat fish. And this is a woman who couldn't walk within the ocean within 10 miles of the ocean because of her iodine sensitivity. By 9 months, she was doing so well, she married Dr. Kelly and became his second wife and began to run his office. And things were going really well because she was extremely healthy. At about a year, though, things started to change. Susie got a little sick. She got tired, fatigued, fevers, chills, sweats, that kind of thing. Nothing serious. Kelly initially thought, as he thought with himself, she had the flu. He said, stay on your program, you'll get over it. She got progressively worse. And what got a little bit frightening for Dr. Kelly and for Susie is she started developing allergies. Now, she'd been free of allergies for about a year. She began to react to any food that she took, even these wonderful raw fruits and raw vegetables. Didn't make any sense. Now, when you're dealing with your wife, nothing scares a doctor more than to be sick himself. That's pretty scary. But when you have a family member get sick, it's just about as scary. Kelly did a lot of manipulations. He increased the fruit, increased the vegetables, did all the things he knew to do to change the proportions of different nutrients to see whether that would have any effect on his wife. And she got progressively worse, not better. After about 2 months of dietary manipulation, his wife really crashed and ended up semi-comatose. And there she was sitting in his house, and Kelly was faced with a problem. If he didn't do something quick, she might die, and he might have to bring her to the hospital, and that would be a great defeat. The local newspapers would have a field day. Crazy quack cancer doctor's wife ends up in the hospital in a coma. And he thought about this a lot, and he didn't want that to happen. And he thought about everything he had done. Well, he had done everything. He had tried every manipulation of raw vegetables, raw fruits, etc. Nothing had worked. The only thing he hadn't done, and it suddenly occurred to him like a light bulb going off, the only thing he hadn't done was give her meat. Well, he thought about it and rejected the idea initially. He says, no one on the Kelly diet eats meat. I'm the raw foods diet. I believe in raw fruits, vegetables. Meat is toxic. Meat kills people. It raises cholesterol levels. It causes cancer. Human beings do not eat meat, period. It's awful. It's evil. It's ugly. 2 days later, his wife was getting worse, and she was going to die, and he knew that. He was a dentist, but he knew enough medicine to know his wife was going. And he said, the only thing I haven't done is given her meat, and I'm going to give her meat. Well, he talked it over with her. She was delirious, but she could understand. She heard the word meat, and she said, no. Meat is not part of the Kelly diet. You're trying to kill me, Donald. He said, you're going to eat meat whether you want to or not. And he went to the local store and got the biggest prime rib he could find, and he ground it up, and he wanted her to eat it raw, of course, because if you cook the meat, you destroy it. And he coaxed her and finally threatened her, says, if you don't eat the meat, you're going to the hospital. Well, she decided to eat the meat. Within 2 hours, she was sitting up in bed. Kelly fed her meat throughout the next 24 hours. She got stronger and stronger. Within 3 days, she was well. Today, Susie Kelly looks 20 years younger than she is, still eats raw red meat 3 times a day, is in absolute perfect physical health. It was exhilarating, but also devastating for Kelly to realize that his own wife was a meat eater because it was contradictory to everything he believed in. It was a 2x4 across his forehead. Kelly always said, you know, when God wants to teach me a lesson, he doesn't hit me with a twig, he hits me with a 2x4 because I'm so dumb I'll never see the message otherwise. Well, almost losing his wife was a big 2x4 right across the forehead. Kelly said, I can't believe, humble dentist from Texas that I am, that I'm the first person in the history of the world to realize there's a subcategory of human beings that not only does well on meat, but thrives on it and gets sick if they don't get it. Well, he went to the library, and he looked, and he looked, and he looked, and he learned about the wonderful anthropologist William Stephenson. Stephenson is one man I wish I could have met, but he's been dead for a while. Stephenson was an American who was trained at Harvard in anthropology. He got real bored hanging around Cambridge trying to figure out what to do with his life, and one day packed up and went up to the most remote regions of the Arctic Circle to study Eskimos. Up to that point, no white man had ever lived with the Eskimos. Now, Stephenson did not believe in armchair anthropology. He lived with the Eskimos, he took an Eskimo wife, he studied their culture, their habits, their lifestyle, their hunting techniques, and he studied particularly their diet. Now, the Eskimo diet stunned Stephenson. It shouldn't have when you think about it, when you think about what the Arctic Circle is really like, but it still stunned him because the Eskimo diet is nothing but a meat diet. Up in the Arctic Circle, there's a two-month summer, and it's not much of a summer. There's no fruits, there are no vegetables, there's no soil, there's just tundra. There are no vegetarian foods at all. All there is lichens, and humans can't digest lichens. All there is fatty red meat, caribou, seal, polar bear, whale, fish, salmon. There's nothing else. If humans are going to live up in the Arctic Circle prior to the point where junk food could be shipped in, all that was available was meat. All the Eskimos could eat was meat. And Stephenson thought about this because he knew enough biology to know that at that time it was believed humans could not live on meat, and even then it was believed that meat was one of the 3 great evils of humankind. So he looked at this very carefully, and he said, here are this whole group of people that not only are eating meat, but thriving on it, because at that point the Eskimos, the primitive Eskimos living the traditional way, were among the healthiest people Stephenson had ever observed. They had no cancer, no heart disease, no diabetes, no obesity. They didn't even have a word for depression in their vocabulary because they didn't know what it was. They seemed to be a universally happy people. They lived in a very rigorous climate, and they were very strong. Stephenson discussed this diet with his biochemist friends in Harvard, and it was realized that their diet, the all-meat diet that the Eskimos were following, was 80% saturated fat. Now, there are executives at the American Heart Society that would drop dead of a heart attack if you suggested a diet of 80% saturated fat. You know, the normal American diet's about 30%, the American Heart 40%. The American Heart Association recommends 20 to 30%. Here is this whole group of people thriving on a diet consisting of 80% saturated fat. Stephenson spent 10 years up in the Arctic Circle. When he came back to the U.S., he lived in New York. He wrote a series of 10 books documenting his experiences. Several of those books specifically dealt with the Eskimo diet. When those particular books were published dealing with the diet, a controversy erupted. It was believed absolutely impossible that human beings could live on meat. Meat was ugly, unhealthy, caused heart disease, caused all kinds of toxic reactions. And Stephenson was called a fraud. Well, you know, logically you'd think, what the heck could they live on? There's nothing up in the Arctic Circle but meat anyway, but people didn't put 2 and 2 together. They figured that, I guess they figured they had some magical source of vegetables and fruit, but there was no source. All they lived on were meats. This controversy raged for 5 years. There were front-page articles on the New York Times because Stephenson was a very prominent figure at that time. He was this wonderful romantic anthropologist who disappeared in the Arctic Circle for 10 years and married an Eskimo. And the newspapers carried front-page articles for years on this controversy about meat. Finally, in disgust, Stephenson dared the New York City Medical Society. He said, I will go into a locked ward at Bellevue Hospital for a year and you feed me nothing but red meat. 80% saturated fat, and I guarantee I'll come out healthier than when I went in. Well, the eminent Professor Tolstoy of my alma mater, Cornell University Medical College, said, let's do it. So for a year, Stephenson lived in a locked ward at Bellevue Hospital with one of his explorer colleagues, and the two of them lived on nothing but red meat, 80% saturated fat, and at the end of that experiment, Stephenson's cholesterol levels had dropped 70 points, he was in excellent health, his weight had dropped, his triglycerides were virtually non-existent, and no one can figure out what had happened. There was a series of about 15 articles in the medical journals discussing this experiment. About 30 people read those. Well, even in those days, it didn't agree with what we wanted to believe. Well, when Kelly read Stephenson's work, he said, my God, my wife isn't an Eskimo. Why should she need to be on red meat? He said, I can understand an isolated group of people who need to be on red meat. Yeah, they're up in the Arctic Circle. But Susie's not an Eskimo. And then he thought, and he thought, and he thought. And he went back to the library. Being a genius is hard work. You have to keep going back to the library. He went back to the library. And he realized about 20,000 years ago there was an ice age, a wonderful ice age. It came down to about the level of New York City. Long Island is the terminal moraine from the last ice age. That's a pretty low latitude to come down. There are lots of people in Northern Europeans who essentially were living in Arctic Circle-like conditions 20,000 years ago. And if you're from Northern Europe, your ancestors had nothing to eat but large fatty animals because the Arctic Circle was moved down several thousand miles. And we're the offspring, many of us from Northern European areas, of people who survived because they could utilize meats very efficiently. Kelly's wife, Susie, was of Northern European descent. Her ancestors 15,000 years ago survived because, like the Eskimos, they could live on 80% saturated fat. And that's about what Susie thrives on, even though she's not an Eskimo. So you've got to think about geologic history when you make determinations about dietary selection. Well, Kelly had his two diets now. He had his vegetarian diet, he had his meat diet, and very quickly he realized there was a third category of person, kind of balanced metabolizers. They did well with a variety of foods, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, some animal protein, fish, poultry, red meat. Three basic categories. Eventually he had 10 subtypes, 90 variations of the subtypes. It all got very complicated. But he realized very quickly that there were three general categories of people. Vegetarian types, people who do very well with fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains, do terribly with animal proteins. The carnivores who do extremely well with meat, particularly fatty meat, red meat, beef, lamb, pork, some poultry, some fatty fish like swordfish. They always need fat. The carnivores do extremely well with fat. They do well with things like root vegetables. I mean, they do well with certain vegetable products like root vegetables. They do absolutely terribly with leafy green salads. If you see somebody at a dinner table and you present them a green salad and they gag, you can pretty much assume that genetically they're a carnivore because their body is telling them that's not the right food for them. Balanced metabolizers, again, somewhere in between. Three basic types. Kelly was a very observant man. Now, this is a wonderful observation to realize that there are three types of people, general basic types that need three types of diet. But he began to realize that each one of those types was susceptible to a particular type of cancer. Now, Kelly had a wonderful laboratory. It was his office. He was seeing thousands of patients with all types of cancer. So he had a wide patient base on which to base his observations. And he noticed that the vegetarian types, the people that did well with the fruit, vegetable, grain diet, tended to get the hard tumors. These are the traditional tumors of the lung and the liver and the pancreas and the colon and the breast and the brain. Hard tumors. The carnivore types tended to get the blood tumors, the lymphomas, the leukemias, myeloma, melanoma. Although it's not a blood tumor, melanoma almost invariably occurred, as in Kelly's observations, among people who did well on a meat diet. Balanced people somewhere in between. They seemed to be susceptible to either hard tumors or the soft tumors. Now, he thought and he thought and he thought. He said, this is a particularly important observation, that certain types of people who do well on certain types of diet develop certain types of cancers and don't develop other types. And he wondered if there's anything physiologically that might explain this. He thought if I could figure out what it was, I might understand something fundamental about cancer. And he thought and he thought and he thought, and he observed and went through the records of all his thousands of patients, and he began to realize there were certain tendencies. He noticed in vegetarian patients there were certain qualities that were almost universally distinctive. These patients tended to have a fast pulse. They tended to need a little bit of sleep. They would do well with 4 or 5 hours of sleep. They tended to be very irritable emotionally. They tended to do very well in the mornings, less well at night. They tended to have very lean faces. They seemed to have a very strong endocrine system. The carnivores were the opposite. They tended to be a little bit more lethargic and laconic. They tended to need about 8 to 10 hours of sleep. They did terribly in the mornings. They didn't start waking up until 1 or 2 in the afternoon, did very well in the evenings. They tended to have a slow pulse. They tended to have very good digestion. Balanced people somewhere in between. A normal pulse tended to need about 6 to 8 hours of sleep, did well at any time of day. He noticed that there were different psychological, physical, and physiological correlates with each type, and he kept thinking and thinking and thinking, if I could figure out biologically what explained this, I might understand cancer a little bit better. Well, he did what he always did. He went back to the library and he learned about the work of Melvin Page. Now, Melvin Page was an eccentric dentist who worked out of St. Petersburg, Florida. And Page, during the 40s and 50s, like Kelly, had determined that there seemed to be different types of people who needed different diets. And his explanation was an autonomic physiology. Now, I'm not going to get too technical, but the nervous system can be divided into 2 basic ways. We need to have a little background right here. The easiest way to divide it is in the conscious nervous system and the unconscious nervous system. Well, the conscious nervous system is the nervous system you use when you drive a car, do the New York Times crossword puzzle, or do a math problem. The unconscious nervous system is a nervous system that controls physiological processes about which we don't have to think. Heart rate, secretion of enzymes, secretion of hormones, digestion. We don't have to think about digestion to digest food. It just happens. Now, traditionally, we thought that the unconscious processes, the physiological processes like digestion and heart rate, were beyond conscious control. Of course, we now know through biofeedback experiences that this is not true. But in general, it's a good, useful dichotomy. Now, the unconscious nervous system in physiology is known as the autonomic nervous system. It's kind of the automatic nervous system, and it itself can be divided into two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Again, I'm not going to get too technical. We have to know these terms. Now, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system tend to work in opposition. The sympathetic nervous system, for example, tends to speed up heart rate. The parasympathetic system tends to turn it down. The sympathetic system tends to block secretion of pancreatic enzymes. The parasympathetic system tends to increase them. The sympathetic system blocks peristalsis in the intestinal tract. The parasympathetic system stimulates peristalsis. The sympathetic system tends to activate the endocrine system. The parasympathetic system tends to tone it down. These two systems work in opposition in every second of our lives to keep our physiology exactly where it should be to do the process that's necessary for that moment. Now, Melvin Page suggested that there were certain people in whom the sympathetic nervous system was overly developed and overly active. And in those patients, the parasympathetic system was correspondingly weak. In other people, the parasympathetic system was strong, but the sympathetic system was weak. And in the third group, the two systems were equally balanced. Kelly immediately recognized that these were his vegetarians, carnivores, and balanced people. Vegetarians tend to have a very strong sympathetic nervous system and a very weak parasympathetic system. Carnivores, the meat eaters, have a very strong parasympathetic system but a very weak sympathetic system, and balanced people are somewhere in between. Well, you might say, so what? It all sounds very fancy. It sounds like a science lecture. But it really is practically important to understand this. And Kelly realized that the importance related to three important minerals: calcium, magnesium, and potassium. The vegetarian diets that his sympathetic system patients were on are loaded with potassium and magnesium. These are very alkalinizing nutrients, and we now know through orthodox neurophysiology that potassium tends to stimulate the parasympathetic nerves and magnesium tends to block sympathetic function. So if you're dealing with a vegetarian who has a very strong sympathetic system but a weak parasympathetic system, a vegetarian diet will tend to tone down the strong system and build up the weak system and bring them into balance. Now, meat is very acid-forming. We're going to talk about carnivores for a second. Meat tends to produce acids in the body. Meat is loaded with sulfates and phosphates. In the body, as every second-year medical student knows, sulfates and phosphates are turned into sulfuric acid and phosphoric acid. There's an enormous load of free acid whenever you eat a meat meal. Now, this has been measured, and that's an extraordinary load on the body. The quickest way to acidify the bloodstream is to eat red meat. Red meat is very acidifying. And Kelly said, well, what the heck does that have to do with autonomic physiology? Well, we now know from studies in emergency rooms that sympathetic and parasympathetic function is very keenly tied into pH, to acid-base balance. We learned this from our experiences with residents, and I think of some experiences when I was a resident. The traditional therapy for a patient who walks in a heart attack is to fill them up with calcium and fill them up with bicarbonate. You load them with bicarbonate. Heart attack patients go into acidosis. Acidosis does awful things, we thought, and you've got to block the acidosis and load them up with bicarbonate. The only problem is a lot of patients that we assume were dying from heart attacks, and I can remember some from my own internship, were dying because we used too much bicarbonate. When you use too much bicarbonate, you turn off the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is the stress nervous system. The one system you want functioning in a period of stress like a heart attack is the sympathetic nervous system. When you block its function, patients can go into fatal arrhythmias like ventricular fibrillation and die within seconds. And it took thousands of patients to die from the overuse, from overzealous interns pushing bicarbonate before we realized that this was not an ideal therapy. You want the pH slightly acid. You get it too alkaline, sympathetic drive turns off, and you can lose your patients. Well, this has been documented in the literature, and Kelly, even back in the 60s and 70s when he was doing his research, realized that autonomic physiology was dependent on pH, that in an acid environment, the sympathetic nervous system is turned on, parasympathetic system turns off. Carnivores, remember, and I know it's a little confusing sometimes, have a strong parasympathetic system and a weak sympathetic system. When you feed them red meat, you turn the body acid, you stimulate the sympathetic system and tone down the parasympathetic system and bring them into balance. Kelly began to realize after documenting and studying thousands of patients that when you got that autonomic system into balance, which is what he was doing with his diet, tumors would go away. It was that simple. When you toned down the sympathetic system and built up the parasympathetic system in a heart tumor patient, when you got that point right there, the tumor sometimes would go away in days. Similarly, if you have a patient with leukemia and lymphoma, you put them on a red meat diet, you acidify the bloodstream, you stimulate the sympathetic system, tone down the parasympathetic system, tumors would go away. He just saw this in his own practice. Very often he would treat a patient for months and months and months, and I've done this myself. You get no progress at all. And in one day, the tumor starts shrinking as if it were melting away like an ice cube on a hot day. And he said, it's all this autonomic physiology. Well, I mentioned calcium. Calcium's probably the key element in all this, and calcium has a lot of applications to anybody practicing any kind of oncology. And although my approach is nutritional and Kelly's was nutritional, it applies to chemotherapy, immunotherapy, or any other therapy. Think calcium. Calcium has a lot of functions. We know it's the main cement for the bones, but it also is very metabolically active. It almost acts like a hormone in the body. It's what's called a second messenger in cells. It's one way that neurotransmitters translate their information into the nucleus. Calcium functions as a carrier of information, as a stimulator of information systems in the cell. Calcium is also primarily and fundamentally the main cement of cellular membranes. Now, it's often been overlooked because we tend to think about protein and fats in cell membranes and not think too much about calcium. But calcium really holds cell membranes together, and this has been documented. Now, when the sympathetic nervous system is very strong and active and producing lots of adrenaline, which is one of its main hormones, cell membranes tend to get very tight. You know, if you inject adrenaline into somebody, their muscles tend to tense. They get twitching in their mouth or in their jaws. Their jaws will tense up. Their muscles will tense. Cell membranes tighten in virtually every tissue in the body. What happens is with sympathetic discharge, calcium goes into the cell membranes, tightens up the membranes. Now, in an alkaline environment, when the sympathetic nervous system is turned off, membranes get very leaky. Calcium leaches out. Membranes leak all kinds of junk. Now, Kelly tried to relate this to cancer, and he began to realize that hard tumor patients, the main problem is the sympathetic system was too strong and the membranes were too tight, and the membranes of the tumors were too tight, and the patient's own immune system and the patient's own pancreatic enzymes couldn't get at that tumor. On his raw foods diet, with his juices and with the extra pancreatic enzymes, the patient would turn a little more alkaline, the sympathetic system would weaken, calcium would leach out of the membranes would get leaky, and whammo, the enzymes could get to that tumor very easily. The patient's own immune system could get at that tumor very easily. Chemotherapeutic drugs could get at that tumor very easily. One of the most interesting things and confounding things in oncology is why you can have two patients with the same tumor in the same place, colon tumor metastatic to the liver. One will respond beautifully with near total resolution of the tumor, another patient won't respond at all. It's pH autonomic balance if you believe Kelly's hypothesis. I happen to believe it. One patient may have a very strong sympathetic system, and you give them chemotherapeutic agents, and those cell membranes are so tight, nothing's going to get in. Enzymes won't get into the tumors, chemo won't get into the tumors, immune system products won't get into the tumors, and those patients die and the tumors grow. If you alkalinize the body, if you loosen those cell membranes, chemotherapeutic agents, immune system products, pancreatic enzymes can attack those tumors, dissolve them very, very quickly. Now, with parasympathetic tumors, the tumors of the blood, leukemia with the opposite situation, what we have found in our own research is these patients tend to be too alkaline, their cell membranes tend to be too leaky. Now, when cell membranes are too leaky and when they're too alkaline, this tends to stimulate cellular reproduction. This is one of our observations, which we're still trying to figure out exactly why through genetic evaluations. But when they're too alkaline, when the parasympathetic system is too strong, when the cell membranes are too leaky, things happen very quickly. Cells in every tissue in the body tend to reproduce very, very quickly. And the problem with these tumors is they're reproducing so quickly that whatever therapeutic agent you use, you're running a race, whether you can break them down faster than they're reproducing. Now, when you use a red meat diet, for example, and the other nutrients which stimulate sympathetic function and tone down parasympathetic function, you get the patients more acid, the sympathetic system turns on, the cell membranes get a little tighter, cell reproduction slows, reproduction in the tumors tends to slow down. That gives you time, it gives you leeway. Now, interestingly enough, acute lymphocytic leukemia, acute myelocytic leukemia, the tumors that tend to occur in parasympathetic dominance, the meat eaters, these alkaline people tend to be very aggressive tumors. I've seen in my own training patients whose white blood count will go from 10,000 to a million in a period of weeks. I've seen patients diagnosed with acute lymphocytic or myelocytic leukemia of adulthood die within 2 weeks of their diagnosis. These are very aggressive tumors. They tend to grow very, very fast. And the reason is leaky cell membranes, alkaline environment, parasympathetic dominance, too-weak sympathetic system, stimulates cellular growth. You push those people acid, you slow down growth, you give the therapeutic agents, be they chemotherapy, immunotherapy, or my enzyme therapy, time to work. So when you're treating a cancer patient, you have to think of autonomic physiology, whether you're using nutrition or chemotherapy. Now, it's very interesting to treat patients with diet, and you can see the mistakes you make, and I'm going to talk about one or two of my own mistakes. You learn from your mistakes. You don't learn from your failures. I like to get up here and tell you I don't have any mistakes. Boy, do I have mistakes. I had a patient, a referral from Pat McGrady, my wonderful friend, who's I think somewhere out in the audience. He referred a patient with lung cancer, a psychology professor from the Midwest. I said, lung cancer, I love lung cancer. It's a challenge. I like a challenge. I like to get people well so I can laugh at the orthodox people. Well, I put this patient on a vegetarian diet. She had a hard tumor with all the right supplements, large dose of pancreatic enzymes, and coffee enemas. Initially, no response. Tumor didn't grow. It didn't shrink. Well, I'm real smart. I've been studying the Kelly stuff for 10 years, and I knew what the problem was. She wasn't alkaline enough. The sympathetic system was too strong. Calcium was staying in the cell membranes. The membranes were too tight. Those enzymes that I was feeding by the pound were not getting to that tumor. The membranes were too tight. So I increased magnesium and potassium. Magnesium and potassium are the ultimate alkalinizers of the body. They suppress sympathetic flow, increase parasympathetic flow, and it worked wonderfully. The tumor started to dissolve. The tumor markers were going down, and I was real proud of myself until one day, Saturday morning, this patient called me up hysterical. She developed terrible pleural effusions. She had edema in her legs. Her belly had bloated up with ascites, and it sounded like she was about to die. I was pretty upset. I was so smart with myself, I couldn't believe that this was happening. And I thought, and I thought, and I thought, and I thought for 3 days, and I didn't sleep too much, and I realized what I'd done. Yeah, I was real smart. I pushed her alkaline. I turned off the sympathetic system. I turned on the parasympathetic system. Calcium was leaching out of the membranes. I pushed her so alkaline that her tumors were exploding. Every cell in her body was leaking fluid because the membranes were so leaky. I very quickly, when I realized what I'd done, called her up, put her on large doses of calcium, gave her certain supplements that we use to acidify the body. Within 3 days, the membranes were tighter than they were. The tumor stopped growing, and all the fluid started to resorb. She did have to get a thoracentesis, courtesy of my overzealous use of potassium and magnesium. I have that patient now exactly where I want her. Slightly alkaline, slightly leaky. The membranes are slightly leaky, but not too much so. When you realize how important or how easy it is to manipulate the body using Kelly's theory, you begin to appreciate the importance of nutrition. As I said earlier, it doesn't matter what therapy you use, whether you use chemotherapy, radiation, immunotherapy, or my enzyme therapy. If you know how to manipulate the body with dietary products, you can get your patient exactly where you want to get them. Exactly where you want to get them, and you can get the therapeutic outcome you're looking for. Now, all this theory is wonderful, and of course, people always ask me, well, what's your success rate? How great is it? Okay, how great is it? I spent 5 years going through 10,000 of Kelly's records. Put this together in a 500-page manuscript, which we could not publish. There are two reasons. People tell me that there are two reasons why we couldn't publish. One reason is the results are too good, and the other reason is the results are too bad. So I don't know. I suppose the truth is somewhere in between. One doctor told me there's no way these results could be so good. Well, what did we find to make doctors tell me that the results are too good? After going through about 10,000 of Kelly's records, we found that patients who were compliant on the program and doing the program properly, which of course they have to do, about 70% of them would get well. It didn't matter what kind of cancer, how advanced it was. Of course, this was a retrospective study and evaluations of Kelly's patients treated in the past under non-controlled circumstances, so it doesn't prove anything by the orthodox standards of proving things. I don't know whether the orthodox standards of proving things are valid or not, but it certainly doesn't meet that criteria, and I'm the first one to admit it. We did one particular study, which I think is, I'm going to mention quickly, and I always mention it during my lectures, and that's our study of Kelly's pancreatic cases, because it's pretty impressive. Dr. Good, the man I was working under, one of the eminent immunologists of our time, the man under whom I did my immunology fellowship, suggested that we really needed a numerator-denominator study to make sense out of Kelly's success rate. Now, what did he mean by that? He means it's okay to find occasional patients who get well, but how many get well? And to do that, you have to track down all the patients treated with the therapy and find out what their outcome was. We decided to concentrate on one particular type of cancer, pancreatic cancer. Why pancreatic cancer? Pancreatic cancer is the worst cancer known to man. It has a median survival of about 4 to 6 months. Virtually no one is cured of this disease in orthodox medicine. We chose that because if there were patients who were alive 5 and 10 years, no one could argue that this was the normal history of the disease, the normal natural history of the disease. Nobody with pancreatic cancer, except rarely those few patients that are treated early with surgery and get cured, virtually none live 2 years. I think the 2-year survival is about 5%, 5-year survival less than 1%. So we knew if we could find a bunch of pancreatic cancer patients appropriately diagnosed, treated by Kelly with nutrition, who are alive 5 and 10 years later, this would be a significant finding. Well, arbitrarily, I decided to track down every patient with pancreatic cancer treated by Kelly between the years 1974 and 1982. We found 23. These are patients who may or may not have gone on the therapy, who may or may not have taken a single pill. What we found, and I did extensive interviews with family members, the doctors who made the diagnosis. That 10 of these patients came to Kelly once, decided he was a quack, their doctors told him he was a quack, never did the program, and the median survival was 60 days after seeing Kelly, which is pretty standard for pancreatic cancer, 2 months. They all died median survival 2 months. There was a second group of about 7 patients who went on the program partially, eventually gave it up, largely because of physician pressure that Kelly was a quack. Even those patients who only did the program partially had a higher median survival, about 300 days, which is significant and significantly higher than the usual median for pancreatic cancer. Third group of 6 patients did the program completely and totally. Median survival is 8.5 years. Most of those patients are still alive. 1 died of Alzheimer's. And as I always say at every lecture, if you have your pancreatic cancer patients dying of old age and Alzheimer's, you have succeeded as a physician. So median survival 8.5 years and growing. Well, that's wonderful. That's Kelly's success rate. In that particular series of cases, every patient who followed the program did well. Yes, it's a small group. It's only 6. But scientific innovations always begin with observations, anecdotal observations, and small groups of patients. They don't begin with double-blind clinical trials. They begin with simple observations. It was a simple observation. No, it did not prove Kelly was a genius, that his program worked. What we've done now is we're putting patients on this program under controlled trials, under controlled circumstances. We don't have a lot of money to do elaborate studies, but we're doing the best we can, and we're following patients very clearly. And what we're finding is Kelly's success that we document, around 70–75%, seems to hold generally true. Now, there are patients we lose. They generally fall into about 3 general categories. Of course, patients who don't comply with the program are going to die. You don't do the program, you die. That's true of any therapy. Secondly, patients who have been too aggressively treated by their previous doctors. Too much chemo, too much radiation, even surgery sometimes can have a very debilitating effect on patients. Sometimes if you get enough scar tissue in the gut from previous surgeries, you can't get the therapeutic agents to the site of the tumor, and tumors will grow. I've seen that happen repeatedly in patients who've had 3 or 4 operations. The third reason why patients don't get well, which is the one that was hardest for me to accept because I was trained as an orthodox immunologist and I believe everything can be reduced to science, but Kelly always said the main reason patients don't get well is lack of faith. Now, I'm not going to go into a big thing on that, but the one thing I have found is patients who really don't believe in what they're doing, whatever the therapy is, are not going to get well. Well, Bernie Siegel, Norman Cousins talk about that. What Kelly did and what we tried to do is figure out the physiological correlates of what lack of faith means. And believe me, I've seen a lot of patients in my office that have no faith in what I do. Most of the patients who come to me figured if I was any good, I'd be heading Sloan Kettering. And if I was any good, I wouldn't be doing crazy nutrition. Believe me, most patients who come into my office are not happy about coffee enemas or carrot juice or vegetarian diets or even eating meat. They think the whole thing is crazy. They do it because they're scared, because everything else has failed and I'm their last hope. They're not there because they want to be there. A lot of patients come in without faith. Some of them get it as they do better. Some of them never get it. And even if they do the program perfectly, if they have no faith in what they do, they die, period. I've never seen a patient who has absolutely no faith in the program, even if they do it completely well, who lives. Interesting problem. Why should that be? Well, when you don't have faith, it creates anxiety. That's what I've seen in hundreds of patients. Lack of faith equals anxiety. When you have anxiety, what happens? Well, when you have anxiety, you turn on the sympathetic nervous system. When you have no faith that things are going to go well, you have to live in a state of vigilance. When you live in a state of vigilance, the sympathetic nervous system fires constantly. When the sympathetic nervous system fires constantly, you get way too acid, cell membranes get way too tight, nutrients and enzymes can't get to the site of the tumor, and the lack of faith through physiological channels leads to death, period. It happens all the time. Now, interestingly enough, with the soft tumor patients, the patients who have the leukemias, lymphomas, myelomas, and melanomas, sometimes lack of faith is a good thing, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. 1982, Kelly was working on a leukemic patient. I happened to be in his office. 6-year-old girl treated at Stanford University with acute lymphocytic leukemia, failed chemotherapy. Now, acute lymphocytic leukemia is the pride and joy of orthodox oncology because it's one of the few cancers that can be treated successfully with chemotherapy. This young lady, age 6, was not doing well at all. And she decided to come see crazy quack dentist Kelly and started his program. And she wasn't doing well with Kelly either. And I said, Kelly, what's going on? Get on the phone, Gonzalez. I'm going to teach you about medicine. Well, I got on the phone. The girl's mother was on the phone. Very sweet woman, kind of Northern California, very into meditation, she said. And she started to talk about what she was doing with his daughter. She said, I'd bring my daughter down to the beach, and I have her think positive thoughts, and I have her draw white cells on the sand and think about them attacking the tumor. And I've read Simonton, and I've read all the meditation and biofeedback books. And Kelly says, the first time I'd ever heard him get angry, he said, you take those Simonton books and you throw them in the garbage, and you go out to your local you go out to your local Kmart and buy that girl electronic games, and you have her start watching 6 hours a day violent cartoon shows on TV. Well, I thought this was a big joke. And I got off the phone. I said, God, he's having a nervous breakdown. Famous Dr. Kelly right in front of me. But he wasn't kidding. And I decided, one thing I learned about Kelly, when he got a tone in his voice, you listen, and you listen carefully, and you don't ask why until later. So he had that woman in tears. He said, no meditation, no white cells growing in the sand, no thinking positive thoughts. He said, I want your daughter to get so mean and nasty that instead of loving her brother, she kicks him in the shins. Well, he got off the phone, and I said, Kelly, what the hell are you doing? You're crazy. He said, I'm not crazy. I'm trying to save that girl's life. Would you rather have her dead? I said, well, what are you doing? He said, she's a leukemic patient. She's too alkaline. Her sympathetic system is too weak. She's already in this alkaline, spacey thing. And meditation and relaxation and positive thinking pushes you even more alkaline. It turns off the sympathetic system. The whole point of biofeedback and meditation is to tone down sympathetic function. And there are dozens of studies in the orthodox literature documenting that. That's wonderful if you have a strong sympathetic system. But if your sympathetic system is too weak and you turn it off, you can die. That girl was dying because her sympathetic system was too strong, too weak. Her parasympathetic system was too strong. Her mother was putting on all these positive thinking things that she had learned about, which was further weakening her sympathetic system. The cell membranes were getting leakier and leakier. The cells were reproducing faster and faster and faster, and even Kelly couldn't get her well. Well, that mother had enough sense to listen to Kelly, went out, bought electronic games, even though it was against everything she believed in, had her daughter watch aggressive cartoon show 6 hours a day, and within 2 weeks the white count stopped increasing, and then within 4 weeks it started to drop. And I saw that, and I wouldn't believe it if you told me the story. I don't expect you to believe it. But it shows you how complicated cancer therapy can be and how easily it can be explained if you start thinking about nutrition, and people would start listening to Dr. Kelly. And I'm going to stop right there.
I just got to think, obviously you people reacted a lot like I did back there, thinking how tedious it is to listen to someone speak so slowly and so haltingly. Obviously, with no enthusiasm also. Actually, what you got was a 2-hour lecture in about 70 minutes. Now, yes, let's give him a big round of applause again.